Welcome to the sixth and next to last presentation in the Teaching Fellows series on the arts. Our presenter tonight is Mark Ladd. Mark says very clearly that theater is his passion. His topic is American musical theater. And I think by the time the evening's over, you will have ample evidence to see why he says that. Mark is in his 14th year of teaching computer science and mathematics. The last 13 years at Kankakee Valley High School. He has a BS and MA from Ball State University in mathematics education. He is a native of Swayze, Indiana. How many people know where Swayze, Indiana is? Oh boy, there's more than I thought. Because he very clearly says it's between Marion and Kokomo, so that we'd all know where it was. Mark's a member of the Prairie Arts Council Board of Directors and the Adult Board of the Indiana Thespians. He is a sponsor of the International Thespian Society Troop number 4383 for 10 years, Director of Theater at Kankakee Valley High School for 11 years, head speech coach at Kankakee Valley for 13 years, and one of the coaches for the academic teams for the past 10 years. He's the founder of the KV Theater Company and producer and director of summer theater at Kankakee Valley for the past 9 years. He's performed in KV Theater Company summer productions as well as productions at Community Theater Guild and Bridgeview Theater in Valparaiso and Lake Central Theater Guild in St. John. Mark first appeared on the stage in the 2nd grade and produced his first show in the 5th grade. This is the most impressive thing out of everything that I have told you. He has attended over 70 productions in the past year, and that includes Broadway, off-Broadway, Chicago, Indianapolis, and in Northwest Indiana. So welcome, Mark Ladd.
One thing that's not in there is that I'm getting over a cold, and so you will hear me frequently coughing, so I'll forewarn you. There we go. As Bob said, theater is my passion. It's not my training. I didn't take a single course in college about theater. Everything has been pretty much from seeing and reading and listening. I have a huge CD collection of musical theater. I was visiting a website, I think it was in October, and one of their questions was, they were kind of doing a survey about how many shows people had seen in the past year, and I sat down and I calculated it out and looked at my calendars and looked at everything and came up with over 70 in that year. And probably if you go back another 3 months, that would probably put it up over 100. So obviously it's my passion, but it's not something I'm used to talking about. I'm used to talking about algebra and computer things and that kind of stuff. So I may not be quite so smooth at talking about my passion. We're going to have some audio clips, we're going to have some video clips, and we're going to have a little bit of theater history. I will gladly acknowledge that a lot of what I'm talking about came out of this book called Musical: A Grand Tour by Denny Martin Flynn, an excellent book on the history of musical theater, and especially American musical theater, clear from its early roots up to relatively current. So a lot of the factual information I got from that. Denny Martin Flynn. And I don't even have any idea where I picked that book up, but so occasionally I'll be referring back to some quotes from it. American musical theater can be traced back to 1866. Of truly American-made, American-produced, American ideas of musical theater. Operettas from Europe had been imported and that type of thing, but truly American musical theater can be traced back to a musical called The Black Crook in 1866. The Black Crook was originally not a musical. It was originally a play that was takeoff on the Faustian legend. An alchemist had to deliver one soul every year in order to extend his own life. And it was a melodrama, and it was a flop. But fate intervened. There was a group of French ballet dancers. I believe there were 100 female dancers in the company, and they had been booked to perform in New York City at the American Academy of Music. That theater burnt down. So there were 100 ballet dancers stranded in New York City. They had no way of getting home. They had no way of making any money other than dancing as a group of 100. And someone had the bright idea to combine forces with it, forming an extravaganza of music, song, and dance. What they did was, whenever things in the melodrama started to drag, let's bring out the dancing girls, perk things up. Wasn't exactly what we think of now as musical theater as far as kind of integrating the music and the dance and into the story. But we consider it musical theater because it had a beginning, a middle, and an end, because you had the melodrama in it, but just kind of interspersed randomly were these big dance numbers. This combination of music, dance, specialty acts, elaborate fairyland scenery, and the plot ran for a total of 5.5 hours on opening night. Which, strangely to me, the book said, was not unusual for an evening of entertainment. An evening of entertainment, usually you didn't have one thing going on for 5.5 hours, but usually there was that much entertainment going on in an evening. So I can't imagine people sitting through that anymore. It's considered to be the beginning of musical theater in America for two reasons. The musical spectacle had a beginning, middle, and end, thanks to the intermittent intrusion of the Faust adaptation. And there was the eye-popping sight of 100 bare-limbed, beautiful girls in an outrageously scandalous new costume, flesh-colored silk tights. It was a scandal. People would come in disguise to come see the show. One preacher was known that he went to just check it out to make sure that it was as immoral as he thought before he told his congregation about it. There were different protests and that type of thing about it, but obviously it drew crowds. It ran continuously for 16 months, playing 474 performances, which was a record at the time. It was revived in New York City at least 15 times and toured the country for 40 years. And there were lots of takeoffs using this exact same idea, many with very similar names. Instead of calling it the Black Crook, they called it the Yellow Crook or the Red Crook, or lots of unusual names. But shortly after it opened, 14 of New York City's 16 legitimate playhouses were presenting something of that type of formula. So obviously it caught on. Probably the other theaters didn't have 100 dancing girls, but especially not 100 French dancing girls. Then we move to 1879, the first production that called itself a musical comedy that actually took on that title. And it was called The Brook. Not the Black Crook, but The Brook. It was written by Nate Salisbury and was the first one to label itself as a musical. Then in 1882 was the first Broadway theater that was actually constructed specifically for musical theater, that was constructed with an orchestra pit and all the trappings to make this musical theater work. that was called the Casino Theater at Broadway and 39th. The next phase they moved into was kind of copying the European tradition of operettas. Americans really didn't go for opera, but operettas, okay, not quite so bad. There really aren't too many that we know now that came from that time period, but they were trying to copy the success of the British and Viennese operettas. First American operetta to succeed was Robin Hood by Reginald de Koven. It opened in June 1890 at the Chicago Opera House by an opera company called the Bostonians. Okay, the Bostonians in the Chicago Opera House. Makes sense. They didn't have a lot of confidence in this production. The total production costs were $105.50. They used borrowed costumes from other operas and operettas. They had very little set other than maybe some pieces that they borrowed from other operas and operettas. But people liked it anyway. In fact, they told a story about one of the producers had to go into the prompter's box and was pretty much feeding the cast every line. The musical numbers they knew. The dialogue, they hadn't rehearsed enough. They'd only rehearsed for about a week. And obviously had concentrated on the musical numbers. But it was enough of a success that the Bostonians added $5,000 for sets and costumes, and about 15 months later, opened in New York City, and it ran for 5 years. The next big successful American operetta was John Philip Sousa's El Capitan, which ran for 112 performances starting in 1896. Operettas had extremely complex love stories with lots of hurdles and complications before they usually contrived an unbelievable resolution. There was little dramatic conflict. Conflict generally arose from the circumstances of the standard plots, and there were just a handful of standard plots that pretty much all of them used. Lovers from different social classes, mistaken identity, disguises, aversion to a prearranged marriage, and poor little girl makes good. Those were pretty much your standard operetta backgrounds. The problem with operettas was to do them right, you had to have a huge chorus of singers, lavish sets, and large orchestras. If you look at old photographs of some of these operettas, you had 60 to 100 chorus singers, which these days is not financially feasible when you're paying them. So you very seldom see American operettas reproduced anymore. They just really didn't have the lasting qualities. Then we move into the phase of a man who started in vaudeville and moved into legitimate theater, George M. Cohan. He was not a big man. He was only 5'6" tall and weighed about 140 pounds. His first show that he produced was Little Johnny Jones. It opened in Hartford, Connecticut in October 1904 with a flag-waving sentiment that became a hallmark of all of his productions. A couple of the songs from that show, even though you don't know the show, I'm sure you've heard the songs. I'm a Yankee Doodle Dandy and Give My Regards to Broadway were both in that very first show. Alone or with his partner Sam Harris, he produced over 75 shows, often taking other people's scripts and Cohenizing them, making them flag-waving big things. Originally, his shows were primarily produced with his family in the leads. The Cohens had been a big vaudeville act. His mother, father, him, and his sister, the four of them. And so a lot of his original shows were kind of star vehicles for them, something to keep them employed. Between 1904 and 1928, he authored the book, music, and lyrics, and directed and choreographed 21 musical plays. So in a period of 24 years, 21 shows. A close friend and fellow performer said, "George is not the best actor or author or composer or dancer or playwright, but he can dance better than any author, write better than any actor, compose better than any manager, and manage better than any playwright. That makes him a very great man." The next period in American musical theater is called the Princess Musicals period. They're called the Princess Musicals because they all started in the Princess Theater. Princess Theater was built in 1912. It was south of the main theater district on 39th Street. It only had 299 seats, just 14 rows with one center aisle. So it was not a big theater. And that changed the way that they did theater, because most shows at that time were big spectacles with dancing girls and fancy sets and big orchestras and big choruses. Well, obviously in a theater that size, you're not going to do that. So they started doing smaller musicals. The three people who were primarily involved were Jerome Kern, Guy Bolton, and P.G. Wodehouse. Jerome Kern went on to work with Oscar Hammerstein and Kern. Guy Bolton and P.G. Wodehouse, they're probably best known as two of the authors of the musical Anything Goes. The limited resources of the producer and the small theater gave them just the opportunity they were looking for. Their songs and comedy, in addition to standing on their own, had to carry the action forward consistently and thus had to be an integral part of the plot in order to keep the audience interested. A song that came from that collaboration but isn't known from one of those shows is well known from Showboat, and it's called Bill, and it was one of the first songs that really kind of advanced the story.
I used to dream that I would discover the perfect lover someday. I knew I'd recognize him if ever he came round my way. I always used to fancy then he'd be one of the godlike kind of men, with a giant brain and a noble head, like the heroes bold in the books I read. But along came Bill, who's not the type at all you'd meet him in the street and never notice him. His form and face, his manly grace are not the kind that you would find in a statue, and I can't explain, it's surely not his brain that makes me thrill. I love him because he's wonderful, because he's just my Bill.
Those of you who've seen Showboat, generally it's staged when Julie is singing most of her numbers. She's kind of sitting up on top of a piano or leaning against a piano. The reason it's done that way is that's how the actress who was first cast in the role, that's how she did it. When she was primarily a nightclub singer that they had seen, and they were impressed with her, and they knew she would work for the mulatto role of Julie. And she sang in a speakeasy, and after performances she would go and sing in the speakeasy still, and which was fine until one night there was a police raid on the speakeasy, and they had to bail out of jail before performances the next day so that the show could go on. So the next phase is the first big musical that has kind of survived till now that we still hear about, is Showboat. The story was written by Edna Ferber, and it first appeared in serial form in Women's Home Companion magazine over a period of April to September in 1926, and then was published as a novel, as was typical of the time. Jerome Kern read it, and he had known Oscar Hammerstein. He hadn't really worked with him much as far as doing a show together, a full show together, but he knew him and knew his reputation, and they were kind of looking for something that they could work on together. So Jerome Kern called Oscar Hammerstein and suggested that that was the story they were waiting for. They wanted to put together an integrated kind of score that really brought all the elements together instead of just having these musical numbers stuck in the middle of a play. Ferber thought a musical version of her novel was a terrible idea. Jerome Kern had hinted around to some people he knew that he knew Edna Ferber and had been begging them for an introduction. Well, one night they were at the theater, and he went up to one of these gentlemen and said, I really, really want to get a hold of Edna Ferber and talk to her about the book. So the guy yells across the lobby, Edna, come here! And so in the lobby of another show, they discussed this whole idea. She finally gave them the rights in exchange for a small advance and a royalty of 1.5% of the gross weekly box office receipts. Kern and Hammerstein wanted control of this production. They wanted to make sure that the ideas that they had came forth. So not only did they write the music and the book and the lyrics, they directed the show. They wanted such control that they didn't even hire a director. It was produced by Ziegfeld, who was well known for the Ziegfeld Follies and these big showy type shows. So this was quite a change for Ziegfeld to do certainly something very different than the Follies. Hammerstein directed the book scenes and the principal songs, and they hired someone to direct the dancers. But he was specifically told they didn't want specialty numbers, they didn't want traditional chorus girl routines, they wanted authentic dances that were brought about by the plot, not just dances that were thrown in, time for a dance number. The first public performance was at the National Theater in Washington, D.C. in November 1927. The show lasted 4.5 hours. People walked out excited about the show, but very tired because shows didn't start till 8:30, and so 4.5 hours later, they were a little tired. So that night, they made 50 minutes of cuts, rehearsed it the next morning, and at the next day's matinee, performed a show 50 minutes shorter. The next day, they cut another 40 minutes off. So they cut 1.5 hours off, so you still had a 3-hour show, but at that time, that was certainly reasonable. most people now balk a little bit at a 3-hour show, but this was a very active time on Broadway. There were 268 shows that opened on Broadway during the 1927-28 season. 18 opened the same week as Showboat, and another 11 the previous Monday. So it was a very busy time. A lot of the first-string theater critics didn't even come see Showboat to start with. There were lots of other things that they thought had a lot more potential. Because, I mean, you got the story of these people on a showboat, you got all the issues that were brought up, the miscegenation, the romance, the dirty, rotten scoundrel who deserts his wife. They didn't think that made for a very good musical, so it wasn't on their first tier of things to cover. It's probably the only show that opened during that 2-week period that we still recognize the name of. Showboat was the first musical that used underscoring throughout dialogue to further the story and to draw so much of the show together. Another unique thing about Showboat was it contained all or part of 10 songs by other writers. Now that concept in and of itself wasn't unusual. Lots of times people would bring in a number written by somebody else, but it wasn't to further the story of the show, it was because it would be a big popular song that everyone would catch on to. All of the songs that were brought in for Showboat were inserted for realism, not by the producer to pump up the show. Some of the songs that Julie sings in the nightclub and some of the other numbers that are performed in the nightclub were written by other people, and they were just for a sense of realism of songs that would be sung during that time. One of them is After the Ball is Over. Was not written by Kern and Hammerstein, but they saw it as an excellent song to bring in the feel they wanted, so they put it there because they needed it, not because they wanted a big fancy number. The original production of Showboat changed American musicals boldly, radically, and suddenly. It's reminiscent of operetta in the ambition behind its score and the exotic setting of life on the Mississippi. And even in its cross-class relationships. Riverboat Gambler, Showboat Captain's Daughter, Mulatto Woman, White Man, but it's pure musical theater in every other aspect. It was written by American-born writers, featured an American setting, and used a vernacular in its libretto and lyric vocabulary, and very little of the score was in 3/4 time. 3/4 time, which is waltz time, was frequently used in musicals. It was a comfortable pace for songs, but very little of this script was written in that. Most importantly, the score is built on rhythm, harmonies, and intervals suggested by the setting. The content dictated the form, not the other way around. So Showboat was one of the turning points. In 1994, New York experienced a remarkable revival of Showboat. Although revival really isn't an appropriate word because he didn't bring back the show exactly as it was. He reworked it, rethought it. It was directed by Harold Prince and produced by Garth Drabinsky. The production restored the sweeping grandeur of the original, though in a grittier, more realistic design style. Many of the things I've read have said that they thought that Hammerstein would be very appreciative of the reworking and would feel that it was true to his concepts. And it was just a lot of technology that was available now that wasn't available then. One of the big changes is there aren't very many blackouts as such in the show. The action kind of flows from place to place on the stage, done with kind of shifts in lighting. You don't have everything go black, the curtain closed, some little scene going on in front of the curtain curtain and opening back up, another big scene. The scene changes were kind of integrated into the production and made the show flow more. And so a lot of times there were little songs written or little sets of dialogue that were done out in front of the curtain just because you had to do a scene change and something had to be going on. So you'd write some stupid little song that really didn't add anything to the story, but it let you make a scene change. So when he reworked Showboat in 1994, he took a lot of that out. The next big show was by George Gershwin in 1935, Porgy and Bess. I'm not going to talk a lot about Porgy and Bess because I've never seen Porgy and Bess, and so I really couldn't pull a lot out of it because I couldn't sit there and go, oh. But Porgy and Bess was a major change in the theater, and George Gershwin was certainly a major composer for the American theater. It has long been a subject of some remark that the arts attract the curious, the crotchety, and the quirked. But dancing seems to be practiced largely by the downright perverted and deranged. That's a quote from Agnes DeMille, who started out in legitimate ballet theater and was grabbed into the musical theater realm and was a large part of one of the major changes in Oklahoma. The Theater Guild had decided to produce a new musical based on Green Grow the Lilacs by Lynn Riggs. It had been produced as a play, and it was a horrible failure when first presented in 1931. They barely had $30,000 in the bank, the producers, the Theater Guild, and few investors to turn to. They had to have numerous backers' auditions to try to raise the $100,000 capital. There was a death in the plot, which was something extremely unusual for musical comedy, even for a villain. The curtain went up on a lone woman churning butter. The first song began off stage with a baritone singing about a beautiful morning, and the chorus girls didn't appear till halfway through the first act. Up until that time, people made their decisions very quickly whether they liked the show or not as soon as the curtain started going up and you saw the chorus girls' legs. If you liked the chorus girls' legs, you were going to like the show. If you didn't, you didn't like the show. So that was one of the big changes. So let me show you a clip of the opening.
There's a bright golden haze on the meadow. There's a bright golden haze on the meadow. The corn is as high as an elephant's eye, and it looks like it's climbing clear up to the sky. Oh, what a beautiful morning! Oh, what a beautiful day! I got a beautiful feeling, everything's going my way.
That's from our production in, what did it say, 94? I hadn't seen that until just now, for probably about 4 years. That was an odd show that we did something a little odd. We had enough talent that we weren't sure how to use them best, so we decided to double cast it, which was something we'd never done before, which was quite an adventure to try to balance the two casts talent-wise, not make one cast feel like they were the good, this is the good cast, this is the second cast. So we called them the farmer cast and the cowman cast, so that way they didn't really feel like one was better than the other, in our opinion. So that was an interesting experience. Don't know that we'll ever do it again, but it was an interesting experience because you had to rehearse twice as much to get everything done. This is Oscar Hammerstein's comments about this big step that they took with this show. The first serious problem that faced us involved a conflict of dramaturgy with showmanship. As we planned our version, the story we had to tell in the first part of the first act did not call for the use of a female ensemble. The traditions of musical comedy, however, demand that not too long after the rise of the curtain, the audience should be treated to one of the musical comedy's most attractive assets, the sight of pretty girls in pretty clothes moving about the stage, the sound of their vital young voices supporting the principals in their songs. Dick and I, for several days, sought ways and means of logically introducing a group of girls into the early action of the play. The boys were no problem. Here was a farm in Oklahoma with ranches nearby. Farmers and cowboys belonged there. But girls in groups? No. Strawberry festivals? Quilting parties? Corny devices. After trying everything we could think of and rejecting each other's ideas as fast as they were submitted, after passing through phases during which we would stare silently at each other, unable to think of anything at all, we finally came to an extraordinary decision. We agreed to start our story in the real and natural way which it seemed to want to be told. This decision meant that the first act would be half over before a female chorus would make its entrance. We realized that such a course was experimental, amounting to almost the breach of an implied contract with a musical comedy audience. I cannot say truthfully that we were worried by the risk. Once we'd made the decision, everything seemed to work right. We had that inner confidence people feel when they've adopted the direct and honest approach to a problem. It took Hammerstein 3 weeks to write that opening number, to write the lyrics, because he was just writing the lyrics. He finally came up with an elegant way to say it, took those lyrics to Richard Rodgers, and in 10 minutes, the song was written. This was also a change in the way things were normally done in musical theater. Up until that point, usually what happened was the music was written first, and then the lyricist found words to fit that music. Rodgers and Hammerstein, in fact, in their earlier collaborations with other people, both of them had done the traditional method where you wrote the music first and then you put words to it. Somehow with them, they came up with the idea of doing it the other way around. Write the lyrics first, because Hammerstein, besides writing the lyrics, was also writing the book or the story of the show. So that way he was able to write the lyrics that really kept telling the story, and then the music was written to fit those lyrics. The production broke every record, playing 5 years and 9 weeks in New York, 2,212 performances, as well as 44 special matinees for service personnel, and spending 10 years on the road in 250 cities. those investors that were brave and took that big step of investing in this show got a 2,500% payoff. And that payoff must have galled hundreds of angels who were begged to invest but refused. The Decca cast album recording, the first ever cast album of a book musical with a full orchestra, sold over 1 million copies. Because of this and because of the way that the drama was told through the music and the lyrics, you could listen to the record and know the story of the play, which most musicals before that, you would really have no idea what the story of the play was by listening to the music. Oklahoma was the first one where you had a pretty good idea of the story just by listening. Another major feature of Oklahoma that was a major turn was the introduction of dance as a part of telling the story. Did you switch the tape? Okay. And so the dance sequence in Oklahoma actually furthered the story instead of just being nice and pretty to look at.
Hold bottle 2 inches from nostril. Close your eyes and inhale. Ask your heart what you really want and wait for the answer. Elixir of Egypt, make up my mind for me. I'm waiting for the answer.
Agnes DeMille's original choreography that was done for the stage was quite truthfully reproduced in the movie, which is also kind of unusual when they tend to adapt musicals to the movies instead of from the stage. There tend to be a lot of changes. Oklahoma, they kept it pretty true.
And into your arms I long to fly. I will come as evening comes to a waiting sky. Out of my dreams and into the hush of falling shadows, when the mist is low and stars are breaking through, then out of my dreams I'll go into a dream with you.
This was another unique thing, having dancers represent the lead characters to do the dream ballet. Mill was given complete freedom in the choreography and asking for additional music, which was something a little unusual at the time too. This is one of those things where almost any production you see of Oklahoma, you see this choreography. Just about every choreographer recreates the choreography for this number. Skies turn dark and you see a tornado in the background now. As her worst fears are realized. Whole different world. Very creatively recycled the songs from the show and did interesting things to them to create the dance number. Which is something that's done a lot now, but that was a radical change. tall girls. This whole dance sequence was considered one of the classics in American theater. A few years ago, for Academic Decathlon, which is one of the other activities I do, in the fine arts section, for the first time in the whole time we'd ever been involved, there was a section on dance. And the whole dance section referred to the Dream Ballet from Oklahoma. I think partially that's because it was something that's readily available. There aren't a lot of big dance numbers that are readily available to people, whereas this one certainly is, and it's certainly a classic.
Laurie! It's time to get started for the party.
Rodgers and Hammerstein appreciated how much that dance added to their show, and how much it helped move forward the story. They continued to write dance sequences whenever it made sense when they created other shows. They didn't feel forced to put a dance in if they didn't think it would help move forward the story. But whenever they could, they added that as an aspect. It's 8 o'clock. Let's go ahead and take the break, and we'll come back here about 1:15. This partnership between Rodgers and Hammerstein came about because both of them had worked fairly successfully with other partners, but their partners kind of let them down or died, one or the other. Richard Rodgers had worked a lot with Lawrence Hart, who was an alcoholic. And frequently he would get into a drunken stupor, and they were in the middle of writing a show and kind of have to put everything on hold till he sobered himself back up. In fact, at one point, Rodgers had him hospitalized and made him stay in the hospital until they finished writing a show. He took the hospital room next door, and they worked on the show while he was hospitalized for alcoholism. Rodgers and Hammerstein's next big show, Oklahoma, was in 1943, and 2 years later, Rodgers and Hammerstein came out with Carousel in 1945. Carousel, they took a lot of the same ideas that had worked successfully in Oklahoma, making sure that the music, the lyrics, everything worked together to help tell the story. They also were able to include a large dance sequence, not nearly as elaborate, but still a fairly large dance sequence in Carousel. One of the unique things about Carousel was the telling of the story with a lot of dialogue, with wrong CD. Was the song
Tell me something.
If
Ain't
I Loved
scared of
You.
me? I mean, after what that cop said about me taking money from girls.
I ain't scared.
Is that your name? Julie? Julie something?
Julie Jordan.
You're a queer one, Julie Jordan. Ain't you sorry that you didn't run away? You can still go if you wanna.
I reckon that I care to choose to stay. You couldn't take my money if I didn't have any, and I don't have a penny, that's true. And if I did have money, you couldn't take any, 'cause you'd ask and I'd give it to you.
You're a queer one, Julie Jordan. Have you ever had a fella you give money to?
No,
Ain't you ever had a fella at all?
no,
Well, you must have had a fella you went walking with.
yes.
Where'd you walk?
Nowhere special I recall.
In the woods,
No,
on the beach.
no,
Did you love him?
no, I never loved no one, I told you that.
You know, you're a funny kid. Say, you want to go into town and dance, man?
No. I have to be careful
Of what?
of my character. You see, I'm never gonna marry. I'm never gonna marry. If I was gonna marry, I wouldn't have to be such a stickler. But I'm never gonna marry, and a girl who don't marry has got to be much more particular.
Suppose I was to say that I'd marry you.
You?
Oh, that scares you, huh? Yeah, you are thinking about what that cop said.
No, I ain't. I never paid no mind to what he
Oh,
said.
but you wouldn't marry somebody like me, would you?
Yes, I would. If I loved you. Wouldn't make no difference what you did, even if I died for
Look, how
it.
do you know what you would do if you loved me, huh? Or how you feel, or anything?
Well, I don't know how I know.
Yeah.
Just the same, I know how it'd be if I loved you. When I worked in the mill, weaving at the loom, I'd gaze absent-minded at the roof, and half the time the shuttle would tangle in the threads, and the warp mixed with the woof. If I loved you.
But you don't.
No, I don't. But somehow I can see just exactly how I'd be.
So that really moved the story along, and it was quite an extensive song. A couple years later, pretty much their pattern was about every 2 years they produced a big show. 2 years after Carousel was a show called Allegro. Allegro was not a big hit, but it made a lot of changes and a lot of new things in American theater that did catch on in other shows. It set the course for Harold Prince and Stephen Sondheim, for presentational numbers, for fluidity, for concept, for de-emphasizing traditional roles. The leads didn't sing much, and for more than anything, experimentation. It was a very bland set, kind of an Our Town type thing. It was set in Middle America, and there are a lot of correlations between Our Town and Allegro. Again, this is another one of the shows that I've never seen produced anywhere, so I don't know that much about it. But apparently it was quite a drastic change, was not a success, but was an important step in a musical theater. So that was in 1947. 2 years later, we come out with South Pacific. Now, South Pacific broke all the changes they'd made. They had integrated dance and ballet into the story. With South Pacific, it didn't fit. It didn't make sense. There was no logical reason to have a ballet. So rather than try to force the issue, they said, that's okay too. If it doesn't help tell the story, we don't need it. There was no choreographer for South Pacific. One of the big, well-known numbers from South Pacific was kind of unusual in the fact that it was a chorus number.
We got sunlight on the sand, we got moonlight on the sea, we got mangoes and bananas you can pick right off the tree. We got volleyball and ping pong and a lot of dandy games. What games we got? We ain't got games. We get packages from home.
We get movies, we get shows.
We get speeches from our skipper.
And advice from Tokyo Rose. We get letters doused with point fuel. We get dizzy from the smell.
What don't we get?
You know damn well.
We have nothing to put on a clean white suit for. What we need is what there ain't no substitute for.
There is nothing like a day, nothing in the world. There is nothing you can name that is anything like a day. We feel restless, we feel blue, we feel lonely and in grief, we feel every kind of fear.
One of the odd things was that was a chorus number, but it wasn't primarily sung in unison as a chorus number. The solos weren't solos by your lead characters. The solos were individual chorus members who each had an individual role. They were each identifiable, and they each had solos, which was also a drastic, unusual change. Another thing about South Pacific is it was not written to have scenes out in front of the curtain to kill time while you were changing sets. it was written and produced in a way that things could flow. The action moved from place to place. Scenery changed as the action was going on stage for the most part. And that was another change. Then 2 years later, they came back and found a story that needed dance to help tell. The King and I. The big dance number in it is The Small House of Uncle Thomas, which very much advances the story. It's a very integral part of advancing the story. Their next big show and their final show together was The Sound of Music. It's another unusual opening, one person alone on the stage, not a big chorus number to open the show. That was their last show together because Oscar Hammerstein died before they could write another show together. He lived long enough to help adapt the show into a movie, the stage production into a movie, but he died in the middle of that process. One of the songs from Sound of Music that a lot of people just kind of assume was already a song because it sounds like what it's supposed to be, was Edelweiss. People think it's a folk song, but it wasn't. They wrote it. really long introductions. And so that was the end of an era, but another era was starting. In 1957, someone who had great respect for the work of Rodgers and Hammerstein got his start in musical theater with West Side Story. Stephen Sondheim. Stephen Sondheim kind of worked as an apprentice at times, and very much Oscar Hammerstein was his mentor. West Side Story had the team of Jerome Robbins, Arthur Lawrence as librettist, Leonard Bernstein as composer, and Stephen Sondheim as lyricist. Jerome Robbins was one of the first author-director-choreographer combinations. It was one of the first productions to use such a complete range of techniques in support of the drama, and a textbook example of how they could be melded. For fight sequences, dance was the primary tool. For more emotional moments, such as expressions of love, song was used. When adults were on stage, the inability of the principals to communicate across the generation gap was presented in dialogue. None of the adults in West Side Story sing or dance, so they're stylistically set aside from the young people. With the Tonight Quintet, Bernstein stretched the standard song form into a musical fabric complex enough for opera.
Just in case they jump us, we're ready to mix. Tonight, we're gonna rock it tonight. We're gonna jazz it up and have us a ball. They're gonna get it tonight. The more they turn it on, the harder they fall. Well, they began it, and we're the ones to stop them once and for all. Tonight.
Anita's gonna get her kicks tonight. We'll have her private little mix tonight. Walking hot and tired, so what?
And Tony and Anita also have their form of it, and by the end, all four groups all five of them, the Jets, the Sharks, Anita, Maria and Tony are all singing against each other, as in opera. But I think in West Side Story, one of the unique parts of it is, as opposed to a lot of musicals now, each part is still clear. You can still tell what's happening in each group. My personal feeling is a lot of times it's used now in musicals and you can't follow what's happening with each group. Whereas this one, it was, in West Side Story, each group was set up first and then it all came together. And so you know what's going on. Whereas in a lot of musicals today, it just happens all at once and you can't follow both lines of lyric. Speaking of lyrics, there's so much going on stage in a musical that the lyrics have to be relatively simple for people to follow them. One of the famous lyricists, Sheldon Harnick, puts down the requirements of a theater lyric as: first, it has to continue the flow of the story. Second, provide insight into characters. Third, heighten climactic moments. And fourth, enrich the feeling of time and place. Then Stephen Sondheim adds two things to that. The actor must have something to act, and the actor must have something to do. There were a number of musicals right around that time. West Side Story, Music Man, and Gypsy, I'm pretty sure were all the exact same year. So there were a lot of tough battles for audience and for the awards during those years. One person who got his start through West Side Story through a tour, actually through a tour in Europe, he got the job to perform over there, was Michael Bennett, who was responsible for A Chorus Line. A Chorus Line opened on October 19th, 1975, and closed 15 years later on April 28th, 1990, after 6,137 performances. The unique thing about Chorus Line is it was the story of the dancers. The whole show was written after he spent a great deal of time interviewing dancers, getting them to actually reveal their true inner feelings. The songs, the dialogue, everything came directly out of those interviews. And individual dancers who may not even have ended up being in the show can point to songs, I'm the one who said that. So that's a very unique form of creating a musical. He didn't really start out with a story ahead of time. He kind of wrote the story as he went along and as he talked to the dancers and primarily dancers. Another famous pair of musical theater is Alan Lerner and Frederick Loewe. They're responsible for My Fair Lady, Camelot, and Man of La Mancha. My Fair Lady was an odd show because it was written as a star vehicle for a star who couldn't sing. That makes sense. You have someone who can't sing, so you write a musical for them. He obviously very effectively was able to sing, but all of the songs were written specifically with that in mind, that he could sing them and not have to actually sing. I'm going to jump to one of my favorites, and one of the most beautiful songs, I think, in American theater. It's from a musical that first appeared on the scene in 1969. (1776). One of the greatest history lessons you could ever show to a U.S. history class.
Want another rum, General?
General? Lord, I ain't even a corporal.
Yeah, well, what's the Army know? What's it like out there, General?
Well, you probably know more than me.
Sitting in here? Sweet Jesus.
The song's called Mama Look Sharp. It's sung by one of the very minor characters who just, a courier who comes in.
Shot dead in the very same day. Had Lexington it was too. Right in the village green. And when they didn't come home for supper, their mamas went down the hill looking for him. Miss Lowell, she found Timothy right off. But Miss Pickett, she looked near half the night for Willie, 'cause he'd gone and crawled off the green before he died.
Mama, hey mama, come looking for me. I'm here in the meadow by the red maple tree. Mama, hey mama, look sharp, here I be. Hey, hey, mama, look sharp. Them soldiers, they fired, oh ma, did we run? But then we turned around and the battle begun. Then I went under, oh ma, am I done? Hey, hey, mama, look sharp. My eyes are wide open, my face to the sky. Is that you I'm hearing in the tall grass nearby? Mama, come find me before I do die. Hey, hey, mama, look sharp. I'll close your eyes, my Billy, them eyes that cannot see, and I'll bury you, my Billy, beneath the maple tree. And never again will you whisper to me. Hey, hey, oh mama, look sharp.
It's one of my favorite songs from any musical. And it's sung by a character who, that's all he does. He comes in, he's a courier who brings some information to the Congress. The Congress adjourns. He's left there sitting with a couple of the other minor characters. And he tells that story and sings that song. And that's all, that's it. He's gone. That closes the first act. and you never see him again till curtain call. Musicals tend to have a particular format for the songs. There's a pattern to what types of songs are in musicals and what order they typically come in. Most musicals start out with a big overture, which is some sort of conglomeration of the songs. Usually the overture has mostly music from the first act, and the entr'acte at the beginning of the second act has songs mostly from Act 2. Not every show has an overture, but most do. Chorus line doesn't have an overture. It's one of the ones that breaks those rules. And every once in a while, a musical breaks the rules, and that's part of what makes it what it is. Next big thing is the opening number. Usually it's some big production number, but not always. Sometimes it's like Oklahoma, there's a woman sitting churning butter, and a cowboy walks in singing. Stephen Sondheim quotes Hammerstein's teachings: if you start with the right opening, you can ride for 45 minutes on the telephone book. On the other hand, if you start out with the wrong one, it's an uphill fight all the way. If the desires of the leading characters aren't spelled out in the opening number, then usually the next thing that happens is called the want song. West Side Story contains a classic. Tony doesn't even know what he wants, but he's bursting with energy, reflected beautifully in the galloping rhythm, that he just can't focus. He's just positive that something's coming. Fiddler's leading man tries to cope with the storms of change around him. The daughters have their want: matchmaker, make me a match. The next thing is the 9 o'clock number. In the vehicle musical, a star turn is best. Ethel Merman's Some People gives us her desires as well as her angry, driven character. In Sweet Charity, Gwen Verdon told us all about her nemesis men. South Pacific's Cockeyed Optimist. Before long, the chorus should fill the stage. Coffee break from How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying. Horst Vandergelder singing It Takes a Woman. At some point, you're going to bring the whole chorus in. Most musicals have some sort of a soliloquy. In Carousel, Billy's major song called Soliloquy is the mother of them all. Billy agonizes over the news he's going to be a father and all that fatherhood entails. We're touched by his suddenly discovered love for the unborn child, even when we worry that he's going to do the wrong thing, which he does. Male chorus numbers. Probably the most famous one is There's Nothing Like a Dame from South Pacific, a stirring sound and the chance for the women to change costumes. And since you have the male chorus number, you also at some point in the show probably have the female chorus number. Frequently you have some sort of a show within a show. In South Pacific, you've got the USO show with Honey Bun. In Gypsy, you've got Let Me Entertain You, which at the end becomes Gypsy's striptease song. Frequently you have some sort of a list song. You say tomato, I say tomato. Why do I love you? Something like that. The song and dance. If you have Ray Bolger, use him. Frank Lesser's Where's Charlie boasts the classic Once in Love with Amy, which basically the whole storyline of the show kind of dragged to a halt, and you had a big dance number for the star. On Once Upon a Mattress, you got a big song and dance number, Very Soft Shoes. In Gypsy, Ethel Merman sang 7 numbers, but she can't dance. So the big dance number is for Tulsa, All I Need Is the Girl. The pure dance number. The Waiters Gallop in Hello Dolly. The Crapshooters Ballet in Guys and Dolls. The rape scene in Man of La Mancha. All of those are the big dance numbers. Lots of times you'll have a barbershop quartet. Obviously the most famous example of that is in Music Man with the school board. You've got the duet. It substitutes for dialogue and helps move the story along, like Do You Love Me and Fiddler on the Roof. I remember it well for Gigi. One Hand, One Heart from West Side Story. The comic song. Most musicals have some song that's just there for comic relief, pretty much. In Kiss Me Kate, you've got the gangsters singing Brush Up Your Shakespeare. In West Side Story, you've got the Jets singing G Officer Krupke. In The Wizard of Oz, If I Were King of the Forest. All of those are comic songs. And if a musical has an intermission, it will require a first act finale. Hello Dolly closes the first act with a parade. Promises, Promises ends the first act with an office party that conveniently turns into a rowdy dance. Then you have the unusual and clever song. In How to Succeed in Business, it's I Believe in You. In Oklahoma, it's Poor Judd is Dead. They're certainly unusual songs. The Flat Out Showstopper. Probably the biggest example of that is Hello Dolly and Hello Dolly. The talk song. In My Fair Lady and Music Man, there's a lot of talk songs in those. The 11 o'clock number, some big star turn toward the end. Not quite the exact end of the show. In Bells Are Ringing, it's I'm Going Back. In Hello Dolly, it's So Long Dearie. Sweet Charity, I'm a Brass Band. Guys and Dolls, Sit Down, You're Rocking the Boat. Brotherhood of Man in How to Succeed in Business. Or The Impossible Dream in Man of La Mancha. All of those are 11 o'clock numbers. Scene change song. Some shows have them, some shows don't. One of the best examples is in My Fair Lady on the Street Where You Live, where he comes out and sings about Eliza and on the street where she lives. That song was primarily written just so they could change the sets. Doesn't take much scenery. It's him by himself singing. He doesn't have to interact with anyone. And then, of course, the ballad. Till There Was You from Music Man. If Ever I Would Leave You from Camelot. As Long as He Needs Me from Oliver. What I Did for Love in Chorus Line. A couple of the leading forces today in American musical theater, probably the biggest one is Harold Prince, who's primarily a producer. He's been responsible for many shows over the years, many revivals, the revival of Showboat, the revival of can't think of what I was going to say. His latest one, Ragtime. A lot of excellent musicals come out in the last few years that have gotten a lot of acclaim. Jekyll and Hyde, Lion King, Titanic, Rent, and Ragtime. Ragtime is one of my favorites. It just opened on Broadway about a year ago. It tells the story of the turn of the century. You've got interwoven stories between the blacks in Harlem, the immigrants who've just come to the country, and the rich upper class people of New York City, and how these groups begrudgingly begin to have to interact with each other. And it's now in my top 3 favorites of shows. I saw it in New York, I think last spring, and it was just one of the most moving shows I've seen. Currently, it's the only one of my favorites that is actually truly an American, although it was actually produced by a Canadian company, but all the people who were involved in the writing and the production were Americans, although Canadians consider themselves Americans too, so because they're part of the continent too. But Livent has been one of the movers and shakers of producing recently, but they've kind of hit a financial stumbling block and kind of gone into bankruptcy at the current point and closed down some of their tours. The Showboat tour that was just in Indianapolis in September was closed down about 2 weeks ago because of Livent's bankruptcy. They closed down one of their touring companies of Ragtime and have canceled performances because of financial difficulties, because the person who ran it spent money much more widely than they were taking money in. So if you get a chance to get up to Chicago and see Ragtime, I would certainly recommend it. And I will cut things off there for this evening.
Thanks, Mark. Mark mentioned he had 3 favorite shows. What are the other 2, Mark?
My other 2 favorites are Evita and Les Miserables.
So, if you haven't seen them, those sound like they might be good because he's sure seen enough of them. That concludes the 6th in the series. The last one coming up next week, we'll have Hal Gray, who's here tonight, talking about American jazz and recorded music. Hal's going to do some live performance as well as some recorded music. So look forward to seeing you all here then. Thanks again, Mark.